I really like this quote from your book. It says, "Pain does not have an economic threshold. Regardless of where you fall on the power and socioeconomic spectrum, you have doubts, fears, and insecurities. You're just a human that wakes up in the morning. And the doubts and fears and insecurities, it's not something we can pay off with accomplishments or money or titles or anything." Can you talk about that?
We have to look past the wealth to the human being, and we have to look at what's called psychological schemas, and we all have them. And a psychological schema is the filter through which we view the world, and that's based on past experiences. So if we look at, there's a profound difference between people who have earned their money and people who are born into money or who married into money. The third bit is not one that gets talked about a lot. But people who have earned their wealth have a much more robust locus of control. And typically they are driven by scarcity mentality. And so somewhere early in their developmental path, they learned that the world was unsafe and a hostile, chaotic, threatening place. How do we get by that? How do we fix that?
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, investor, and a founding partner of Sicard Associates, a boutique investment firm founded in New York City. Join me on this quest to unearth the wisdom of the ages. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're tuning into my podcast. For your convenience, the show is available on a multitude of platforms, including Spotify, Apple, Google, Audible, and many more. If you want to keep up with all new episodes, and there's so many more in the queue, make sure you subscribe and please do share it with friends and family. Review it and rate it if you can. Every little gesture matters, and I thank you for it. If you'd like to know more about me, or if you're interested in getting in touch, simply Google my name and it will lead you straight to my website. There's a contact form there, or check notes to this episode for links. I love hearing how you listen to my podcast on your walks, hikes, alone times, drives, trips, and more. I trust that my guests and I are a wonderful company on those adventures. I also enjoy reading how some of you are rehearsing and answering some questions that I ask my guests. I love hearing that. If you're new to the show, please scroll down and check out all the amazing guests I've had over the last few months. If you are serious about investing, money wisdom, wealth, and living a better life, you'll find plenty of episodes with some incredible ideas. For those who enjoy reading thoughtful pieces, I regularly write articles on Substack, which I'm sure you'd find insightful. Find me there and follow me as well. Finally, I'd like to mention my latest book, Crisis Investing. It's a collection of 100 essays that I penned for our clients during the tumultuous times of the global COVID pandemic. These essays are both timely and timeless, providing a unique perspective on navigating through crises. They were never meant to be published, but here they are available to you. Please find the book on Amazon. The book has already received considerable recognition and much love, ranking among the top releases on Amazon in its initial weeks. Thank you for your support and for being a part of my listener community. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. In my work as an investment advisor to families, I get to know not only the stock holdings in the portfolios, but also the people whose money we manage. The topic of wealth and wealth psychology is of great interest to me and my partners. Dr. Paul shares his unique and intimate insights. My guest today is Dr. Paul Hokemeyer. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and raised with his older brother in the gently rolling hills of Harford County, Maryland. From an early age, Dr. Paul was confused by the world in which he was born. Struggling to find his place in it, he embarked on a transformative journey that took him to Alajuela, Costa Rica, where he studied Spanish as an exchange student, to college in Cleveland, Ohio, law school in Columbus, Ohio, and to Washington, D.C. and Amsterdam, where he worked in the realm of environmental and social justice. Eventually, he found his place as a psychotherapist helping other human beings repair and make meaning out of their lives. In his debut title, Fragile Power, Why Having It All Is Never Enough, Dr. Paul, who's become the world's foremost authority on issues related to our celebrity and power-obsessed culture, reveals the fragility inherent in the status we desperately crave and provides a roadmap to avoid self and relational destruction from misplaced aspirations. We talk about his book, about the COVID pandemic impact on the well-being and the mental health. Please help me welcome Dr. Paul Hokemeyer.
Well, hello, Dr. Paul. How are you? Nice to see you.
I'm good. Good to see you as well.
Wonderful. As you know, I'm a big fan of your book, Fragile Power, and we'll talk more about it. We are not in the same field, but I feel like we work with the same people. And as we spoke briefly just now, I think there's some interesting overlaps between our worlds. As much as I'm focused on investments, I think a big part of what I do is understanding the people behind the portfolios. And I think your book gave me some tools, ideas, framework to understand them a little bit better. Before we talk about the book, I'm always curious about the author. So I'm curious about you, and I'd love to hear more, if you indulge me, about your childhood and upbringing, and how do you think that time influenced your interests, and how did it lead to your career path that you're on right now?
It's not a brief story. It's a rather long story. How I kind of got to occupy the niche where I am now. I grew up in America. I'm American. I was born in Baltimore City, and then when I was a year old, my parents moved my brother and me out to the suburbs. And I grew up in the suburbs of Maryland, and it started as a community. It was generally a middle-class community, and over the years became wealthier and wealthier, and people were building these extraordinarily big homes with tennis courts and swimming pools. And I remember riding my bicycle around those neighborhoods and thinking, who are these people who live in these huge homes? That question has basically stuck with me my entire professional trajectory and personal life. Went to college, was an economics major in college, again, because I was just fascinated by the power of wealth and money. Was in banking for 2 years with a publicly traded bank and a mortgage department, and became fascinated by decisions that people made around wealth and behavioral economics, and saw that some people dealt with money very differently. Some people were very overly responsible. Some people were not responsible at all. I was fascinated by the psychology of wealth. I decided to go back to school and go to law school. I wanted to become a lawyer because I really valued intellectual and academic thought. Became a lawyer, went to work for a large firm as a corporate bankruptcy lawyer. Again, fascinated by the destruction inherent in wealth and how wealth could cause the demise of multinational, multi-million-dollar corporations, and that had such an impact. Was able to leave the practice of law at a young age by a fortuitous circumstances, and went into the realm of philanthropy and was working in environmental justice. And in that space, I saw how people of wealth were really being objectified and manipulated by organizations that were doing terrific work on behalf of our planet, and saw that this dehumanization was unsettling to me. September 11th happened, and I was actually living in Europe. I was living in Amsterdam, working for Greenpeace International, running their principal gift program. And as a white privileged male who had grown up in America, the security of my world had always been guaranteed. And I had a profound experience, a traumatic experience to that event. And I moved back to America and really decided to recalibrate my life, think about what I was doing yet again, and started working with one of America's wealthiest families, doing concierge lawyering for them. And in that family was a profound addiction and mental health disorder that had not been properly treated or addressed for a number of years. And I observed that the money, the wealth in this family was causing the pathology. And that shocked me because I was taught that if you have enough money, then you can solve all of your problems and you can buy yourself out of any situation. And I saw that that was exactly not the case with this particular family, that there were dynamics that were occurring within the family that generated from the wealth that were actually causing the pathology to continue and deepen. So I went back to school. You'll see this pattern here. I'll have a bit of an existential crisis and I'll go back to university. So I'm running out of degrees. I'm not running out of existential crises, I assure you. Um, so I did a master's degree in clinical psychology with a focus on family systems because I knew systemically there was an origin there. And then as part of that work, I had to do clinical hours, and I did it at a free clinic working with HIV positive transgendered sex workers, highly marginalized people who live in the world in positions of powerlessness. And I was working as a professional with people who lived in the margins of society in positions of extraordinary power. And I saw that in the real field of mental health, the field of mental health had done a pretty good job of working with people who live in the margins of society in positions of powerlessness, a horrible job of working with people who live in the margins of society in positions of power when it comes to mental health and addictive disorders. So yes, I went back to university, I did a PhD, and I did a qualitative study of ultra high net worth identity and how that identity manifests itself interpersonally, intrapersonally, and social culturally. And as a result of that work, I teased out 3 distinct cultural markers, which I write about in my book, which are isolation, suspiciousness of outsiders, and hyperagencies. And I took that work into the field of behavioral health, and that's the niche that I have been working in for probably the last 15 to 20 years, working with mental health issues, the intersection of ultra high net worth identity and mental health. And so here we are.
Quite a journey.
Quite a journey.
So tell me about the book. The title is Fragile Power: Why Having Everything is Never Enough, Lessons from Treating the Wealthy and Famous. And in the book, I read how it explores the understudied and often misunderstood world of the wealthy and powerful. How did the book come about? And when you think of the audience, who did you have in mind?
Yeah, you're asking all the spelled-on questions. Again, not a silver bullet here, a very circuitous journey. The book came out as a result of the trainings that I was doing around the world, that I was basically I was training clinicians around the world on dealing with ultra high net worth patients in the field of mental health. And Hazelden, which is the publisher, came to me and said, would you be interested in writing this book? Well, actually, they came to me about writing another book, which was about passive aggressive behavior. And I was like, well, I have this body of work that I've been working on for the past 10 years. How about that? And they were not the first publisher who I had talked to. I'd always wanted to write a book. Writing a book for me I remember when I was a lawyer practicing in this law firm, one of the partners came to me and said, Paul, you're kind of a good lawyer, but you don't seem very happy here. What would you really like to be doing? And I just blurted out. I said, I think I'd like to write a self-help book. And he looked at me rather curiously and said, well, I don't think you're in the right place to do that. Sure enough, he was right. So I'd always wanted to write a book. And part of my training as a lawyer, was reading and writing and analyzing data. And so I always enjoyed that process. And so I had this body of work, I had this body of research, and I had written the book with a very clever editor, Joanne Miller, who was with Basic Books forever and did all of Irvin Yalom's books. And we shopped the book around, and the mainstream publisher, wanted something salacious. They wanted like The Devil Wears Prada, and they wanted all these salacious details about my patients. And I'm like, that's not how this isn't my clinical philosophy, is that we don't objectify and manipulate these patients, these human beings, for our professional ends. And, no, that's just not how this is going to work. So I took the book back. I thought about self-publishing it. I rewrote it. Then Hazelden came to me, and I had an amazing editor at Hazelden who really understood, Vanessa Tirado, who really understood the importance of giving this work clinical integrity and not using it as sensationalistic, not to be the Devil Wears Prada, or there's a whole genre of books, the Primates of Park Avenue, that sensationalize and demonize this population. And this isn't about that. This is about looking at this group of individuals as a culturally distinct minority that has distinct cultural markers and who needs culturally competent care in the provision of their professional mental health services.
I'm curious to hear about the COVID pandemic years. I think it impacted all of us in various ways, but also on the front of well-being. And I'm curious about your thoughts and specifically how that time influenced the affluent among us?
COVID was very significant for us individually and as a species, I think. I think that for our clientele, for ultra high net worth individuals, couples and families, it really brought to the fore a number of issues related to their well-being. I think that it showed us just how fine and thin and tenuous the line between health and illness is. And I also think that it showed us how thin and tenuous the line is between order and chaos. I think that we can all remember, I certainly can, where we were, say, March 13th, 2020, right?
Mm-hmm.
That where the world was falling apart. The stock market had crashed. We had this new pandemic. There was an enormous amount of political unrest. There was an enormous amount of social unrest that continued. And it really felt like the apocalypse was at hand. And again, I think that if we look back at the origins of my work, where, thinking, being taught, living in a capitalistic society, that money is the keys to the kingdom, and that if we have enough money that we can buy our way out of things. And to a large measure, we can, right? We can live in the safest neighborhoods. We can drive the safest cars. We can eat the healthiest foods.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some things that money just can't buy. And the unknown of COVID, the ambiguity around it, that we didn't know how you got it, that we didn't know how you cured it. There wasn't a cure. There wasn't a vaccine. There was an enormous amount of fear and chaos. And just like markets don't like fear and chaos, human beings don't like fear and chaos. And so I think that this was the first time that it really brought to the fore a number of issues for families and individuals of wealth. It gave them pause. It gave them time to stop, really,
Mm-hmm.
and to think about what's important, and to say, okay, I have this quantitative wealth, but how about the qualitative wealth in my life? And it gave us a pause. I had a patient, a very clever young man, who said, Dr. Paul, I think Mother Nature got very cross with us and said, no, all of you just go and sit in your rooms until you figure out how to be better human beings. And I think that was spot on. I think that was it really brought to the fore those issues for people who are aware and who want to be aware.
You mentioned briefly, but I'd like to explore more the cultural markers of the population that you work with, the isolation, the suspicion of outsiders, the hyper-agency. Can we go a little bit deeper? What are they and how they become visible, how they influence the individuals?
Sure. Well, we'll start with the first, which is isolation. So, I think just by terms of who we're talking about, right, the top 10%, the top 1%, we're talking about a distinct minority. And with that minority identity comes isolation. One of the things that I'm constantly observing in my practice is the isolation that occurs amongst people of wealth, that they live in a very isolated world and they have a hard time sharing the challenges of their lives and their personal realities because they're going to be shamed for it. I mean, because people have a view like, oh, well, again, the dominant cultural view is if you have this money, you don't have any problems in your life. Right. Is like a fantasy. And that's just not the case. This isn't, and I get this pushback in my career all the time that this isn't a better than, less than analysis. Mm-hmm. I get, well, aren't poor people's problems more important than rich people's problems? Well, no, they're not. I mean, I'm a mental health professional. And so anxiety is anxiety. Anxiety is anxiety. If you're living on, $10,000 a year, or you're living on $100 million a year, the anxiety is there. The treatment interventions are going to be different. And so it's very difficult for patients to find culturally competent care where they can sit in front of a clinician who is not going to judge them negatively for their worth, or who is going to objectify or raise their fees because they're, worth X number of dollars, that they can come forward with their fullness of their being. Mm-hmm. And the second is tribal, and that is suspiciousness of outsiders. Now, all human beings who belong to a minority group are tribal, right? We orient ourselves around common foes and against common interest. And there's no difference from people of wealth. That's because it feels safer. it feels safer to associate with other people of wealth because you're not going to have people constantly asking you for things. One of the things about this population is people are constantly asking them to solve their problems and to get them out of jams and to buy them houses and to buy them cars and to pay for this or to pay for that. And so there's a sense of relief and comfort that comes from being with another human being who, is just not going to ask you for anything. Who's going to be with you because of who you are. And then the third, and this is the really distinct cultural marker of this population, which is hyper agency. And that means that money enables us to orient our lives to avoid discomfort. So part of the value of having wealth is that I can drive a nice car. I can live in a comfortable neighborhood. I can fly private if I want to. I don't have to stand in a queue. I have a concierge doctor. I have all of these services around me that cushion my life and that, by the way, add to my isolation and the fact and cause me to exist in a tribal community. So these all feed on each other. Now, again, this isn't a judgment issue. This isn't a better than less than. This is just a what is. And if we know that there are just cultural markers for this population, then clinically we know that we need to address those cultural markers, just like we would address the cultural markers of certain religious populations. I work with people all over the globe from all different religious affiliations, Muslims, Jews, Christians, fundamental belief systems, and I work within their cultural belief systems. And if we have a culturally distinct population, then I feel as a professional, as a mental health professional, then I have an ethical obligation just to meet this particular clientele in their cultural markers, just like I would meet a Muslim in their cultural markers, just like I would meet a woman in her cultural markers, just like I would meet a queer person in their cultural markers. And again, this isn't a better than less than. This is just a what is.
Mm-hmm. I really like this quote from your book that I shared with you. In my notes, it says, "Pain does not have an economic threshold. Regardless of where you fall on the power and socioeconomic spectrum, you have doubts, fears, and insecurities." I really like that. And I think it tells the truth that no matter where you belong in the society, at the end of the day, you're just a human that wakes up in the morning. And the doubts and fears and insecurities, it's not something we can pay off with accomplishments or money or titles or anything. Can you talk about that? You touched on it briefly, but I think it's very telling that at the end of the day, it's a human being sitting in front of you with some trouble.
Well, that's right. And so in order for me to create what's called a reparative therapeutic alliance, I need to be trustworthy. The patient needs to feel intuitively that I am worthy of their trust and that I can hold the enormity of their truth. And part of that comes with being a person of wealth, that they know that I need to have the cultural competency to understand and to have the capacity to empathize with what that is like, and to understand what it's like to live an isolated existence, to understand what it's like to go on a holiday and say, for instance, you flew private and chartered a yacht. Who are you going to share the joy of that experience with, right? So, or the challenges that were inherent in that without having somebody attach immediately to the fact that, oh my God, you flew on a private plane and you stayed in a yacht. That's how most of humanity is trained. And that's not the issue. Yes, that happened, but at the same time, feeling alone, feeling like you were ignored by your husband, feeling like an outsider in that experience those are the clinical issues that need to be addressed. And to get there, you can't stop on the fact that, oh, you were in a yacht, and so you should just be grateful for the fact that you were in a yacht. And most people that's not an effective clinical intervention at all. In fact, that's called cultural destructiveness. You're actually pathologizing the patient and shaming them for having this experience that they have. So again, this isn't a better than less than, it just is a what is, and being able to go beyond these external markers of success or these external labels of, again, rich, poor, white, black, Muslim, Jew, and attaching to the human being and being able to reach them in their authenticity. That's where the repair occurs. That's where the healing occurs.
I see it in the investment world, how people say, what does it mean to be rich? And it's a different amount for different people, and it means different things. But at the end of the day, you could have somebody that has hundreds of millions or billions that is as afraid of ending up with nothing as somebody that has $10,000. I actually heard those comments from people that have money that is hard to imagine to spend. And when I ask them what keeps them up at night, it's the fear that they will wake up one day and have nothing again. And we'll talk more about it, but I think these are the fears that you can't escape from. I like another quote from your book. You talk about the insatiable hunger for more that causes most celebrities to self-destruct. And I see it in the investment world, where some people accomplish already an incredible success by all measure. And yet they reach for even higher and higher risks. And there's so many very publicized stories of people losing billions within days because of some incredible bets that they take. And I'm curious to hear more. Why do we end up risking something we can't afford to lose in moments like this? And how to address this insatiable hunger?
Well, you addressed it spot on. I mean, we have to look past the wealth to the human being, and we have to look at what's called psychological schemas, and we all have them. And a psychological schema is the filter through which we view the world, and that's based on past experiences. So if we look at, there's a profound difference between people who have earned their money and people who have are born into money or who married into money. That's the third bit is not one that gets talked about a lot. But people who have earned their wealth have a much more robust locus of control. And typically they are driven by scarcity mentality. And so somewhere early in their developmental path, they learned that the world was unsafe and a hostile, chaotic, threatening place. How do we get by that? How do we fix that? We fix that by acquiring stuff. We think that the more money that we have, the more safety that we can have in the world. And to a large measure, that's true. I mean, the data shows that money does provide security. It does give us peace of mind. If you don't fix the internal schema, and that this schema gets hardwired into our central nervous system. It's deep in our limbic system. There are two bits of our brain that are important to talk about here. There's the limbic system, which is the amygdala, which is the deepest, most primitive part of our brain, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive functioning. It's in the part of the brain. There's a dance between the two of them. People who view the world as unsafe, and through a lens of scarcity are motivated by the primal brain. Mm-hmm. This notion of having enough is just not, their brain just can't, there is no enough, because the world is so chaotic and so unsafe, and they're constantly motivated by their amygdala, by their reptile brain. And so their prefrontal cortex hasn't really fully come online to say, whoa, hold on here. Maybe Bitcoin isn't such a great idea. Maybe this investment, maybe going down in a submarine to view the Titanic isn't such a great idea. There's this insatiable need for more and more and more. And that is a function of our neurophysiology and neurochemical. And we need their interventions, psychological interventions, psychopharmacological interventions, and other interventions that are highly effective in rewiring that central nervous system to recalibrate it to a more rational place.
Are you familiar with the book Die with Zero by Bill Perkins?
I am familiar with the book, yes.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because when I was listening to you just now, I was thinking, obviously it's a thought-provoking idea, and he tells the story of an ant and a grasshopper ant that works all the time, never has any fun, and the grasshopper that jumps around and probably has trouble surviving winter. And the idea that you could spend the whole life accumulating something that you think is so important for your safety and survival, and there is no moment to actually pause and think about how much do you really need to feel safe. And I see this in the world of investing in such a big way, where people are so committed to growing the snowball, the pile. But at some point you have to realize that you can no longer run. There's no need to run anymore. The pile is growing on its own fast enough. And I think you touched on it in a great way right now. But I think it's fascinating that to convince yourself that there's no need to run anymore. And I think it's a process.
It is a process, and it needs to come internally. It has to come from within, and it's highly individualized. And who am I to tell a patient that you have enough? I mean, they need to come to that conclusion on their own, and maybe their life force comes from the acquisition of wealth and growing their wealth, and that on a very primitive, unconscious level, that they feel like that they would die, that they would be annihilated if that stopped. And I mean, it's their whole life. And if you look at the amounts of wealth that your clients and my patients have accumulated, it's extraordinary. I mean, the 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 grit, the resilience, the focus, the work that it takes to attain those levels of wealth are extraordinary. And so you just don't stop, you just don't turn on a dime one day and, like move to a middle-class suburb and take your family on a Disney cruise. It's just not
It
what is
doesn't
going to
happen.
happen. No, it doesn't happen. And so we need to remember it. We need to remember that it's not up to me to decide. It's up to the client to decide. It's up to me to help the client make the decision, for sure.
I was writing down a quick note here, how in life we're going towards things or away from things, and they motivate us in different ways. And I think at the beginning on my journey, a lot of journeys that I've seen, it's away from something. Somebody that had nothing wants to have something, or somebody that was, we're always or often enough running away instead of going towards. Do you have some thoughts about that? What motivates us better? What's a healthier way of looking at it? I know that away from something is much more powerful, I think, it seems, than going
No, you're
towards.
right. I agree.
But you can't spend your life like that. It's hard.
You can spend your life like that. A lot of people do. Is it a rich, rewarding life? I don't know. It wouldn't be for me. It probably wouldn't be for you. I think that, we have to look at this from a holistic standpoint. And I think, professionals such as yourself who are thought leaders and innovative in this field are beginning to look at this more holistically. And in addition to quantitative wealth, really having conversations around qualitative wealth. And so being able to have the time to sit down and say, okay, here you are in this moment of time with your portfolio. And like looking forward, do you want to continue to focus on the quantitative wealth, or do you want to focus on some of the qualitative wealth? And do you want to do a combination of the two of those? And, think Socratically. I mean, my clinical formulations are based on humanistic stance. I need to be able to empathize with people who are different from me. And as a lawyer, I was trained in the Socratic method of inquiry, right? So Socrates was thought of as the smartest person in the world, but not for what he knew, but for what he didn't know. And being able to cultivate this sense of unknowingness with patients. And particularly the third stool of this, the third leg of the stool of my clinical practice is working through a feminist lens of understanding that power differentials in our society cause pathology, but also working collaboratively with our patient. One of the things that I learned on early with this patient population is that I cannot come at this through like my position as a white male with a PhD and a JD degree, because this population, they will wield their power. That will destroy our relationship. So I need to work collaboratively and through the Socratic method of inquiry, be able to enable the patient to look at other realities and really dig deep and understand what it is that they really truly want, what's working in their lives and what's not working in their lives. So it has to come from the patient organically, but it's up to us to help them understand that a holistic portfolio has quantitative and qualitative aspects to it.
So in my line of work, I notice it's very important to have the right client for the right money manager. And we're not a money manager for everybody. And I don't think everybody could be a good client for us. And it's an ongoing process of discovery, especially when we onboard new clients. In your book, you mention how in your profession, you get fired and hired back again. Fortunately, it doesn't happen to me as much. I don't think we have ever had the experience of we had families, dynamics change and evolve, and the assets were spent or moved away, or sometimes even poorly invested. But that aside, can you talk about this experience of working with someone and accepting the fact that you could be fired only to be called back again to come back and work together? What's the experience like? It feels like a bit of a roller coaster from reading your book.
It's certainly a roller coaster, it's certainly damaging to my ego. I can't wait until I understand that my job is not, as a clinician, is not to placate. It's not to be another employee in the system and to tell people what they want to hear. My job is to analyze a situation through an empirically based lens, come up with a clinical diagnosis, and then work with that diagnosis to come up with interventions to address it. When we're looking at behavioral health issues, when we're looking at mental health disorders, when we're looking at personality disorders, those are deeply entrenched and they are resistant consciously and unconsciously to change. And so when a clinician challenges a patient or opens their eyes to something that they would not have, they would prefer not to have their eyes open to, they're so used to being in charge and to being able to hire and fire people that comes into play. And I tell patients things quite frequently that is uncomfortable for them to hear, that you are working in something called the Karpman triangle, which involves relationships, drama in relationships, and how we vacillate between roles of victim, persecutors, and rescuers. It's not a very flattering diagnosis to hear. And if you're dealing with a narcissistic patient who is grandiose and has a fragile ego, that's not something that they can easily hear. Again, this is where the art of the work gets in. I need to have a strong therapeutic alliance with the patient before I could deliver this. It comes in the way that I deliver the news to the patient. I have to be, have firm clinical data to support my decision. But again, it comes in the delivery, and frequently I'll tell a patient something that they don't want to hear, and they will disappear for a while or fire me. And I'm flattered when they come back. At the same time, even though it does bruise my ego, because look, these are relationships. I generally care. Like you said, I don't take on clients who I don't think that I can add value to and who don't have some level of internal motivation. So it hurts, I get my feelings hurt when people walk away. At the same time, I'm a professional. I'm a licensed professional, so I have an ethical obligation to attempt as best I can to move the patient in a reparative direction. And that often means giving something in a relationship that they don't currently have in their lives. And so I'm not just another person on your payroll who I'm going to tell you what you're going to hear. I'm not a sycophant. And I can walk away, I'm not, you can't buy me as a clinician. So that's important for me to have that. And the fact that I know that professionally and have that professional integrity helps me deal with the bruise to my own ego that I get when I get fired.
It comes with the role that you play, I can tell. I'm curious about the wonderful article that you shared with me, addressing family entropy in the context of behavioral health challenges. And you talk about a new paradigm of a culturally competent and clinical excellent care. And you introduce us to the idea of a holistically healthy family. And you have a 4-point solution that you talk about. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Oh, sure. One of the things that I've found over the years is that there isn't empirically based data to help professionals such as yourself, and family offices and families, ultra high net worth families, guide themselves through this process, particularly when they deal with a behavioral health issue. And when I say behavioral health, it's an umbrella term that includes mental health, addictive disorders, personality disorders. And so what I've done through a peer-reviewed journal article is set forth a framework, a guideline for families to use when they are confronted with one of these issues. And the 4 steps include information gathering, that as a clinician, you need a clinician who can enter the system to observe clinically what's going on and systemically what's going on. Is the Karpman triangle at play here? Is there enabling going on? And then based upon that, the information gathered, do a risk analysis and determine what issues are acute, what issues are chronic. And then the third is formulating a treatment plan to address those through an empirically based clinical formulation. And then the last step is risk mitigation and family repair. So actually entering the system as an outsider who will change the dynamics, the relational dynamics that are occurring within the family while simultaneously getting the appropriate care that the clinician needs. I make no mistake in that I can do everything for a family. That a large part of my work in working with families, when I'm working with families, is working as a quarterback, as if you will, to get the proper psychiatrist, to find the right family therapist, to find the right individual therapist, to get the proper medical care as needed. So, so it's basically working, entering the system, joining with the system in a way that changes the system so it operates around health as opposed to around pathology. Because we know through systems theory that when there is pathology in a system, the system devolves to a lower level of functioning. That everyone in the system, if you have a patient, if you have a family member that suffers from a bipolar disorder, you know that the whole family is constantly revolving around the chaos and destruction that's occurring as a result of that illness. And we need to address that and get the family to start revolving around health and repair.
It's a wonderful article, and I don't know if it's public already or not, but I will include a link if it is in the notes for everybody to have a chance to read it as well. I have a big question about sudden wealth. So with quite a few guests on my podcasts that come from various aspects of the investment profession and family lawyers and so on, we talked about the experience of receiving sudden wealth, whether it's inherited, whether it's the sale of a business, and you write about the sudden wealth syndrome. I think there's something we can learn from your experience if you could share about the sudden wealth experience that people have. What happens?
People who have sudden liquidity events frequently have crisis of identity. And that crisis of identity, for lack of a better word, blows their circuit, right? Mm-hmm. So I have one patient who was a school teacher and really was strongly identified as a school teacher, and parents were professionals. Father grew up in a very middle class, very strong work ethic family, and so that this liquidity event that occurred within the family totally like blew her gaskets. So she didn't really know. So suddenly she was an heiress, and she didn't really know how to incorporate that identity as an heiress, which has an enormous amount of, there's a lot of stigma around that, right? If we think of like Paris Hilton and people who are not, and she was quite she was everything, the most opposite of Paris Hilton that you could ever find. So there's a process that people will have to go through. There's psychological concepts called accommodation and assimilation. And so they need to accommodate this new identity into their psyche in a way that causes assimilation, that where they can identify in a healthy way as opposed to a pathological way. And what happens when people win the lottery or come into an unexpected or unknown inheritance is that all of a sudden they've been given this extraordinary power just by virtue of the wealth. Now, they don't necessarily want the power, they didn't ask for the power, but the world projects all of this power on them. And now all of a sudden the world is looking at them in a profoundly different way. Mm-hmm. And it causes patients to spiral down, depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, and destructive spending. And a lot of this, even though that there's there's an element of this that's conscious, but a lot of this is unconscious, that their central nervous system becomes so dysregulated by it that they act in very chaotic, very destructive ways, giving huge amounts of money away, buying expensive things that they subsequently can't afford, just running through the money because the electricity, if you will, inherent in that wealth is just too much for them to handle, too much for them to hold.
I had twice on the show Byron Tully, who wrote the Old Money book. Yeah. And one of the advice that he offered was to keep it a secret for a while.
Right.
And I see it with my clients that it might be one of the better advice that one can offer, that in the moment when it happens, and usually they see it coming and so on, but once it does happen, it always feels very sudden and feels like it's an overnight experience. And when it does happen, maybe it's good to give yourself time to you yourself adjust to this new reality, and the circle of people around you, your friends, your relatives and family, also give them a chance to adjust as well. But that time gives you an opportunity to slowly adapt to a new reality instead of sharing it immediately with everyone. Just give yourself some time.
Very sound advice. It's similar to, the analogy, the analog is to coming out as a gay person, a queer person. You have to really understand it and accept it yourself, and then you begin to share that identity with people who are trustworthy and who you have a high degree of intimacy with. And then based upon your level of comfort, you can start increasing the sphere of people. But very sound advice that this gentleman gave and that you take.
Yeah, I thought so. It was, whenever it comes up in a conversation with a client, I think I'll bring up his book and his ideas, and just giving yourself time to adapt. Yeah.
Time, right.
So through my writing, I wrote a few books about family wealth, and a lot of people reach out to me, and from my work as well, I hear all kinds of stories. And there are certain themes that I wanted to discuss with you, and I'm curious about your feedback. People that inherited wealth, people that created wealth, and people that did both, grew the wealth they inherited. So one of the themes that I've heard about is the fact that if you're growing up with a lot of wealth, it takes away the chase, the appetite, even the color from the world around you. Somebody even told me that it feels like a whiteout a day after a blizzard. Everything has no color. There's nothing to pursue. Nothing is exciting anymore. They can't find the reason to be excited about things. Can you talk about that theme among people that either usually grow up with big wealth, and they never really had a chance to struggle for anything, and they search for ways to prove themselves? And I've heard stories of success when they find a completely different pursuit that has usually nothing to do with money, to prove themselves that they can do something independently from the family or the original family fortune.
Yeah, I think that's, again, very spot on. Psychologically, the difference is related to something called locus of control. And so people who have inherited their wealth are more skewed towards external locus of control, that the things outside of themselves, their last name, their wealth, their position in society, their family, are the things that define them. And they don't know who they are at their core, and they don't trust themselves to be able to survive in the world absent this particular wealth. And again, as you said so articulately, it's not really until that they prove themselves in some field independent of the wealth that they are able to feel more safe and secure in the world, right? Which gets back to what we've already talked about earlier in the conversation, which was this schema of scarcity and is the world a safe place, or is the world a threatening, chaotic place? So it's very important that children of wealth find something that is uniquely theirs, whether it's sports, sports is a good place to do that. Competitive sports, drawing, painting, some interest that they can pursue. And again, I think, this notion of a whiteout is brilliant, right? I mean, we get the most wonderful metaphors from our clients and patients. And that if you grew up flying private and vacationing on charter yachts, then, the rest of the world, you've operated on such a high rarefied position that the rest of the world does seem, a bit dreary. And why would I participate in that? And they get kind of paralyzed into action. And, again, this is a case where everybody wants a silver bullet. Like, what the question you get all the time, the question that I get all the time is, how do I raise kids that aren't screwed up by the money? And there isn't a one size fits all here.
No.
It's so much dependent. It's like you have to look back. There's something called a family genogram, which we use in family systems work to trace pathologies in families, and it goes back generations to see, is there intergenerational trauma, was there substance use disorders? And I think it's important for families to do genograms financially. Like, what's the narrative of money in your family of origin? And to be able to take a look at that, and to be able to say, oh, this is the dynamic, and this is how family has impacted my family in healthy ways and destructive ways, and then focus on the things that have been healthy, and we'll also focus on the things that aren't healthy, but focusing on minimizing the unhealthy things and maximizing the healthy things. And it's such a highly, no two families are alike. No two kids are alike. And just recognizing what that is. One of the things that I often hear my patients say is, we have this family foundation, and my father thinks that I should take over the foundation, but the foundation isn't all that interesting to me. And I so get it that, giving money away, if you don't have a sense of identity and don't have a sense of place in the world, just really adds to the feeling of inadequacy and pathology that you have. And talk about having people view you as an ATM machine or a cash machine. Just tell them that you have a private family foundation. You have lots of friends. But that just adds to this feeling of inadequacy, and the imposter syndrome, in a lot of ways, is what we're really talking about here.
I think you touched on so many interesting things. The one I want to point out is family stories. And in many of my conversations, I see the families that collected and even sometimes wrote down in a book the family stories where the wealth came from, especially if we're working now with the fourth or the fifth generation. I think it's very helpful to have some sort of a link, a relationship with the money that's still around, very substantial in many cases, but just to know the story of the ancestor that took all those risks, usually traveled to a different country and accomplished something, and show the connection with today, why this money is still even around and what it could mean and how it could benefit in their lifetime and possibly for the following generations. The other interesting theme I see is some sort of a drive to waste, mismanage, spend the wealth. And it came up in a conversation, many conversations, but one specifically with Ted Oakley. I don't know if you know him, but he's also in the investment profession. And he said that people that create wealth and come to him with the 50 million, 100 million, and hundreds of millions sometimes, the minute they sell the original business, somehow they're trying, or consciously or subconsciously, to part with it. It's as if they were more comfortable with having nothing again. And I see it among people that inherited wealth sometimes too, that they think they would be somehow better off if it wasn't there. And it's not a conscious decision to just ship it away, but somehow take all those little decisions to somehow make it go away. It's self-destructive in a sense, and it's sometimes painful to watch. Do you have some thoughts about it? Why do we want to have nothing again?
Well, we don't really want to have it. We just don't want to have the angst. It's a self-soothing mechanism, right? Because we're talking about the limbic system. We're talking about amygdala reaction. And so if we look at fight, flight, or freeze, so essentially it's typically one of those things, right? Freeze means I'll ignore the money. I pretend like I don't have it. I have patients who talk about that. Fight means I'll push against, which you talked about before. And destroy it unconsciously. And flight, fight, or flee, which means I'll run away from it. I'll just pretend again that it doesn't exist. And so we're looking here at a amygdala system. We're looking at central nervous system reactions, and we need to address that. And I think the way to get around that is to engage our prefrontal cortex. Listen, I have these conversations with my patients all the time, and I tell them, you have three options here. You can pretend that the money doesn't exist and just go on with your life. Your kids are going to have to deal with it. So I'm not sure that's a great idea, right? You could spend it all. You could spend it all away, or you could learn how to, integrate this, accommodate this, and assimilate this into your identity in a healthy way. These are the options that you have. Which one would you prefer to take? Of course, I want them to take the one that's healthy, or, I want them to say, well, Dr. Hokemeyer, let's accommodate this and assimilate this into my identity. But just sort of giving the people this option and raising the awareness of what's happening is incredibly powerful. I have patients who are worth, for instance, I had a patient who was worth, say, $60 million. And he was worried about having enough money. And I said to him, look, if you have a good advisor, which I assume that you do, at 5%, you're making $3 million a year off that, right? First time he ever heard that. First, he said, Dr. Boy, you're the first person that ever told that to me. I'm like, how could this be? How can he be the first person that ever told you this? But yet, here we are. And so having that awareness totally changed his perspective on the world. Again, it's just presenting the options that are available. And most clinicians like your profession are all over this, right? I mean, you guys are numbers, you're all over these numbers, and you can, but mental health professionals, if we're dealing with a patient who's suffering from depression, who feels like they don't have a sense of purpose of life, being able to kind of engage talk about the money is critically important. And most
Mhm.
clinicians are not comfortable talking about the money, and most patients aren't comfortable talking about the money too, because what remains one of the few taboo topics in our society and our culture still is wealth. It's very impolite to talk about money and wealth,
Mhm.
right? Particularly amongst the old money, if you will. New money, not so much, but old money, right? Talking about money is still very much a taboo topic, and the reasons for this is that for people of wealth, talking about their wealth exposes them to risks, an enormous number of risks. Now we have to deal with cybersecurity, or we have kids who are being kidnapped, right? There's some very real risks associated with being a person of wealth. Uh, and so having a safe, contained space to be able to talk about these issues, just having that alone is incredibly reparative for many of these individuals who are suffering in silence as a person of wealth.
It's very true. There's a story in your book about somebody that inherits wealth and her brother, and she doesn't know if he inherited more or less. She has no control because it's a trust with very high restrictions. And the theme that I find and come across all the time, it's sometimes not important how much was given, but how it was given. And you have some thoughts about it. I wrote it down at some point, and I thought it was interesting because sometimes the way the gift is delivered matters more.
Absolutely. And if we look at money, money is a metaphor, right? Metaphor for love. If you love my brother more, you give him more money, right?
Mhm.
Families are dealing with this all the time and trying to always be equal. Not always, but trying to be equal amongst families. And again, money is just a metaphor. It symbolizes something else. And in many families, it's construed as love. And one of the pathologies that I saw sort of when I first started working and why I was drawn into this field was that the family, the child who had the substance use and bipolar disorder, dad just thought if he could keep throwing money at it, that it would solve the problem. And what the child wanted was dad's love, unconditional love. And dad didn't know how to do that because dad built his life. He thought that if he would just provided enough financial security for his kids, all would be well. And so he didn't develop that part of his personality. He wasn't, dad's a great person. He's a great guy. He just didn't have room in his life for emotional vulnerability. To attain the level of wealth that he attained, emotional vulnerability was not part of the equation. And yet, when he needed it in his family, he needed some outside help to develop the tools to get there. But he dealt in the currency that he was so successful in, which was money.
Mhm.
Like, whatever it costs, just fix this problem. I don't care what it costs. And yet that wasn't what the daughter needed. The daughter needed to be seen and validated for who she was. The only time she would get dad's undivided attention was when she would spiral down into destruction, because then he was there 100% with the money and with a team of experts. But what she really wanted was dad. Was this conscious? It was all unconscious. These were all unconscious dynamics that were playing out in the family. So, but part of the work, part of the repair, is bringing those dynamics out of the unconscious and into the consciousness, so that we can begin to then have interventions to move the family to a higher level of function.
Mm-hmm. It's one of many stories in your book that I really enjoyed. I know you have to run in a minute, so I have one last question for you. I
Sure.
like to ask my guests about their definition of success, your own, if you are willing to share.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's something that I've been working on for a long time. It's having a sense of place and peace of mind.
I like that. And I think you found your true calling. Reading your book and talking to you, I can tell that it's very fulfilling. It's hard work. Looking at my own pursuit, I feel like it's hard work, but you're so much closer to the client because we are one step away, meaning we manage their money, but you actually help them with themselves. You're as close and as one can be as a doctor. helping them out and helping them live better, more fulfilling lives in as many ways as possible. Because they do have the means to make a lot of things happen, but there's still work left.
They certainly do. They certainly do. Well, thank you for that. It's a privilege. I feel very privileged to be able to do the work that I do in the way that I'm able to do it. So I appreciate your support, and I appreciate, your thought leadership in trying to provide the highest level of care and services to the clients who you too have the privilege of serving.
I feel very fortunate, and I enjoy every day, and I'm learning every day too. So I learned something today, and I'll include
Amen.
links in the notes to this episode so people can find your articles, your book, and continue to learn with you. Thank you so much for today. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski. The content of this podcast is for general informational purposes only, and so are the opinions of members of Seacard Associates, a registered investment advisor, and guests of the show. This podcast does not constitute a recommendation to buy or sell any specific security or financial instruments, or provide investment advice or service. Past performance is not indicative of future results. More information on Seacard Associates is available in its Form ADV disclosure documents available at advisorinfo.sec.gov.